All right, I think we're live. This is exciting. Just checking to make sure everything is working. Okay, it appears to be. One more quick check, just to be sure. This is exciting. Yep, I'm at about a 3-second delay on my monitor here. Okay, so a couple things in real quick. The test is going to be on Monday, and it is going to be my chair squeaks. It's going to be 3 short answer questions. So don't forget, each short answer question will consist of 3 sentence short IDs. And one for sure will be on total war. One for sure will be on trickle-down economics. Well, conservative economics or the conservative era. And you have to answer those 2. And then your other choices will be such things as why the U.S. entered the war, the road to war, the 20 society after the war. So pretty basic questions. So that'll be a total of 9 short IDs. But remember, they're 9 3-sentence. And then there's going to be, I'm looking at about 10 to 15 multiple choice. It's a little quirky on form, so if I can make it work. If not, you might just only have 3 short answer questions. And I'm going to do it on form so you can type it right there on Teams. And getting to that, after doing the DBQs, after doing the quizzes, it is a little bit too cumbersome to go back and forth between Gmail and Teams. And so from now on, please turn everything in to Teams unless there's some issue with that and you can't do it, then let me know. It is harder to keep track of on the computer, especially with everything coming at once, and I just don't want to miss something. And so if you can turn it in on Teams, that would be a lot better. Once again, any issue, let me know. And you can turn in pictures on there, and so that works. Actually, I've had a number of students do that so far. And you can turn in a Google Doc. If you do turn in a Google Doc, you have to have it share with me, or at least put down an email address that I can make another copy and then share with you, so I can make comments. But it seems to work really well if you just do it right there on Teams. It's quirky and there's issues with Office 365, but please do that. All right, and so now that we're done with that, let's get going. From right now, I'm not going to make this as an assignment, and I think from now on I will make watching this an assignment, and all you'll have to do is just check in. But for this one, you have to watch it. But trickle down will be on there, and you're not going to get what I'm going to tell you out of the textbook or the review book, and that will be a big hit to you. Speaking of that, let's start. By the way, it's another cool Chicago scene right there, the 20s. And so, last time we had class, when I started, it was the Harlem Renaissance. And let's see, Harlem Renaissance, it's the flowering of African American culture during the Great Migration to Harlem. So this is what I talked about when I finished class last time. It seems so long ago that we were in school. But let's get to the Roaring Twenties. And the video did a great job. If you have not finished watching A Walk Through the 20th Century with Bill Moores, you are accountable for the material on there. And it is on my webpage. You'll find the link. Okay, so Roaring Twenties. And a lot of it's a myth. And the myth was created partially during the time, but more than anything else during the Great Depression, when people looking back and said times were good. You see a similar thing after World War II. They'll look back to the 20s. And it was seen as a time of fun and glamour, speakeasies, and a nice little picture of the dancing. I love the hats. And of unbridled prosperity. Sure, the country did prosper. Did this go off? quick check, just. It seems to have quit. I don't know if it's streaming or not. So can you hear me right now, anybody? What a great place for me to stop right there. I think I'm back on again. Yes, I can see the chat. It looks like I'm on. It's just for some reason it went off mine. And so I'm going to restart this thing. And so you get to watch this. I don't know why this isn't working. What appears to be on. So I'm back. All right, so a time of fun and glamour and prosperity. That was weird. It just went off on my little monitor screen. And so I think it seems to be working now. Okay, so I got fun and glamour, prosperity, but the prosperity was uneven, and it's a really big time of worshiping the individual. You see a lot of that in this era. I made it on my own gumption, my own courage. And this fits in with that free labor ideology we've talked about, and an element of social Darwinism. I made it, and if you don't, that's your fault. And this will have great effect during the Great Depression. But the reality, and this is important to remember, it starts with the Great Depression and with a horrible recession and ends with the Great Depression. And that book ended the 20s to let people know that this was really a myth about the prosperity, the even prosperity. And so, naturally, it's time to show you a great big deer in the streets of Missoula. And I agree. I wish we had one of those all the time. It's some parade. I don't know what's going to happen with the vigilante parade, but think about it. Okay, so this is an era also of a growing conservatism, a very conservative time. And in one area was fundamentalism. Now, normally people think about that as religion. That's why I put the heaven or hell, your choice sign. And that is Tommy Thompson, who up there was a very famous radio evangelist, went around the country with these big tent revivals. Thousands would come out. And that actually is a fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a term from the early 20th century, whereas the idea of going back to the real fundamentals of the church. And most existing churches, their dogma, both Protestant and Catholic, we're talking now about Christianity here, but were wrong. And those who believed it were actually going to hell. And this was also called millennialism, the idea that we're already in end times. And so it is time to save yourself. And you see a similar thing happening in Islam and other religions too. It's actually quite fascinating how that happened. This is where the term, like for example, the rapture comes out of this era. And so you have this idea that what they've been teaching is wrong and get ready for end times. And with that, we better start thinking right. And therefore, this modern era was making us lose our way. It's this fear of modernism. But that fits in economically. There's a lot of instability with the new machines, the new consumer economy, the new jobs and new occupations, and those who are a little bit older are losing some of the status they thought they once had, and that fits in with the fear of losing power. Workers, especially who you once had a skill that was replaced by a machine, they felt as though that they're losing status, losing position in society. And checking my screen, it still seems to work. But you see the same thing with men worried about women perhaps taking their position in society as women demanding suffrage, and then that new woman, the flapper, even though that was only a tiny percentage of women who could actually afford to have that style. And the same thing with the Great Migration. As African Americans moved north, and in fact it fits in with the growing nativism and the Great Migration. This nativist idea that people are coming over, radicals, especially this new Bolshevism, that nobody's really sure what it was, but there was that fear of communism and anarchism, but it's going to take what I have. And when you're on top, if your position in society has the highest status, and those who want to reach your position, to many people that feels like a step down, not bringing people up. And that gets into an element of social Darwinism. I deserve where I am, you don't deserve where you want to be. Or you don't deserve to be in my position. I've earned it. I've worked for this. I should not help you. You should not have this position. And you'll see this concept even before the Industrial Revolution with anger against the French Revolution, authors like Edmund Burke. And this is where you get this, go back then to the idealized time. And go back before all these machines and technology and this new way of thinking. You'll see that with talk about going back to the 1890s. They would say going back to the gay 90s. In the Great Depression, go back to the 20s. In the 1970s, during the instability there, it was to go back into the 1950s. And that's where you see all these shows and music shows like Happy Days and music more like the 1950s. And that's where the concept of the good old days. And one important element is that's where people knew their place. And therefore this hierarchy would be maintained, and those on top will not lose their status. And you see elements, waves of conservatism in the late 1970s. Your lifetime, much of it has been a very conservative time, and there are now fights between those who are more conservative and those who aren't right now. So it's an interesting time today. This is personified by what we saw in the video, the Scopes monkey trial. And that was in Dayton, Tennessee. Tennessee had banned the teaching of evolution. Ironically, Dayton wanted a lawsuit because for a combination, they thought the law was bad, but more than anything else, they wanted a big high publicity case in Dayton so people come. And so here is a cartoon of like the Pied Piper leading children to the, using education, leading children to some dark place. It says disbelief in God or the Bible. But the whole point is that education was destroying children. And this argument goes to this day. We're teaching the wrong things. You'll see this over and over again. But about teaching evolution, John Scopes was actually a substitute teacher. And he taught, just kind of mentioned natural selection. But they knew this case would come up. And it became international news. And William Jennings Bryan, the great Democrat, great as in great stature Democrat, would be the prosecutor. And he hated social Darwinism so much that he thought evolution and natural selection and other sciences cannot be taught because that is leading people down the road of social Darwinism. And looking back at it, he was arguably completely wrong because he wanted more equality, and he did not believe in many of the tenets of social Darwinism, and yet he took the position that's actually more pro-social Darwinism. That's kind of the funny thing about this. And even though Bryan won his case, this was not a great, there's a myth that public opinion turned against this fear of science and the country became more open to science. That is not true. There'd be a fear of teaching science education all the way until the late 1950s with the Soviets launching Sputnik and the fear we're falling behind. Bryan, though, was humiliated. I think he knew he was taking the wrong side, and he was allying himself with people who disagreed with him. And he died 8 days after the trial. So this was also a time of great economic growth. Productivity went up 43%. And I'll come back to this, but that means that workers were producing 43%, or their output was 43% greater after 10 years. This is a pretty remarkable time. Now, it would be greater in the 50s and 60s. We have very low productivity right now. And that's where we get the age of the machine, but it'd be focused on the three big things: automobiles, construction, and that's why I show a picture of the Empire State Building, and you can see the Chrysler Tower in the background. That is an awesome picture, but I'm a little scared of the heights. And the radio. And I use the radio because personified consumer electronics. So that chart shows the gross domestic product, which is the size of the amount of all goods and services produced in the United States. And there's a trend line in kind of a blue-gray. But the other line shows a pretty big peak in the 1920s, and then the Great Depression, and then the explosion that would happen during World War, or through the New Deal. You can see it go up dramatically during the New Deal, and then with World War II and well beyond. And so it just gives you an idea. It says $1999. Don't worry about it. All we care about is what the graph looks like. And so Henry Ford would personify this new era. See a couple pictures of them producing cars right there. But a couple things Ford did that are important I have to get to. Ford, in fact, this is called the Great Bargain. He promised higher wages way back in 1910, $5 a day. There's been a lot of inflation, so that was a really good wage. Other companies were furious with him. He overpaid what the market said. But he made this deal. It was this implicit deal with his workers. You work hard. You'll get good pay. You'll be a loyal worker, and you'll buy Ford cars. And that was the deal. Now, it would break down in the 1920s. This deal would come back again in a way from up until the late 1970s. It's not there now. There's not an implicit agreement that you'll work for somebody and you'll be guaranteed a job. But he emphasized standardization, and that is seen by his use of the assembly line. He didn't invent it, but it perfected it. Keeping workers in one spot, moving the cars down the line. And these couple pictures show workers doing the same thing over and over again. It's repetitive, hard work, but they can go fast. They don't make mistakes. They become very good at one job, and that's the definition of economies of scale. Assembly lines have to be big, so only the biggest corporations can do it at this scale. They become more efficient, and with that, their costs go down and production goes up. Eventually, a 1929 Model T was $269. One was coming off the assembly line every 93 seconds. The problem was they were producing more than what people could buy. They needed mass production when there were 5 million cars a year being produced in the United States in 1929. And there were over 10 auto companies. Many of them had combined, like for example, a bunch of car companies combined for General Motors. But this would lead to a lot more concentration because only the biggest could afford this, personified by Henry Ford. And that is where we get this consumer economy. And because of mass production, workers have got to buy goods. It's not enough just for a few rich people or companies to buy the goods, like steel production back in the 1890s. And that means wages have got to keep up. The problem was wages did not keep up. And so to buy the goods that people needed, debt will go up. Thus the installment plans. That is a thing from 1924 from General Motors, showing how many cars are being bought and significant numbers on credit. Over half of the cars are bought on credit. Virtually all of them, all of the retail cars, by credit. And that graph shows the increase of household debt. That's the blue line, or the red line, the dash line. The blue line also shows how the top five's income went up in this era. And there is a correlation there. Average workers, if their wages are stagnant, have to borrow. And that's where we get to the plight of the workers. The workers at this time were, where are we at here? Okay, that's right. The workers at this time of the myth of prosperity were actually in a very difficult time. Unions were destroyed by the Red Scare, and that generally helped keep wages low. Workers were scared to organize. They'd be fired immediately if they do. And so workers just had to accept whatever they could get. And unemployment was not that high, but still unemployment existed because of technological unemployment. That's machines replacing previously skilled jobs. And so yeah, there might have been work for people, but they didn't pay as much. And because of this, workers were scared to demand higher wages, and therefore wages remained low. In fact, during the decade, 93% of workers, so that bottom 93, which is weird to say, bottom 93%, their wages actually dropped, a net drop. And wages were stagnant for most workers. And that's a situation that would happen again in the 2000s through today. And 50% of the poverty line were in poverty or below. Now that was $750 a year. Don't relate that to today. Dollars. There's been a lot of inflation. Now that graph shows, as you can see, wages and salaries dropped. Wages and salary as percentage of total income in the United States. So it was only 40% by the end of the decade. What that meant is the other 60% were things like profits from speculation in stocks or real estate or dividends. So workers' wages were actually a lower percentage, and they had no choice but to go into debt, and eventually they couldn't go into debt anymore. Farmers were hit even worse. The median farming wage was $273 a year. Now that includes sharecroppers also. And so they're even more in poverty. And remember, every farmer's in debt. So all it takes is, heck, just an average year, and farmers will be crushed as they would be in the 1930s. And so you have this underlying insecurity at a time where there's this myth of prosperity. Movies help that. You'd go to the movie, they'd watch it, everyone's rich. So with that, we have vast inequality of wealth. And inequality of wealth had a number of reasons. First off, monopolies. As companies begin to merge, and that's why I showed the number of mergers there, they went up dramatically. That's the blue line during the 1920s. And the red line is essentially the mergers of the number of companies left. And that's the number of mergers. And monopolies concentrate wealth to those who own the monopolies or the big shareholders. By 1929, and this graph shows it, only 200 companies had half of all business. And that ironically fueled speculation. If money is focusing to just the top and those businesses and those who invested in them, they can only buy so much. And as they get more money, they start speculating. And that's where you get a big increase in debt. Because the 20s, for those on top, seem to be unending wealth. I can do anything and I'll get rich. And so they started borrowing more and more. And the margin rules for the stock market, where you only had to put 10% down. You put 10% down, then the bank will loan you 90% of the value of the stock being your collateral. So if you have $1 million, which is a problem we all have today, if you have $1 million, why just buy $1 million? We're all going to get rich tomorrow. Let's buy 10 million and owe that 9 million because we know our stock will go up in value. The stocks never quit going up, right? Therefore, by 1929, the richest 1% had approximately 51% of the wealth. It could be higher, it could be lower. It's really hard to tell wealth. But that means the bottom 49% only had 49%. In fact, this graph really shows it. Maybe. Yeah. This graph shows it by the blue That's 0.1%. Goldish, I guess, or I'm sorry, blue 0.01, gold 0.1, red 1%. That means the bottom 99% has only 49% of the wealth. That means how many cars can they buy? How many houses, radios, etc. And of that 49%, most of that is in the hands of the next top 9%. So wealth was really focused. The bottom 50% had virtually no wealth. And by the way, you'll notice that the trending is that way again by 2012, and it's about that. It could even be higher now because of the most recent tax cuts. And the bottom 50% today have negative wealth. I repeat, negative wealth for the median. So let's get to the policies of the 1920s. We're talking government policies. And it fits in with that conservative era. Isolationism, which we'll talk more about when we get to World War II, and trickle-down economics. Trickle-down is conservative economics. Remember, laissez-faire economics. Its roots are in Hamiltonian economics. And there's Uncle Sam, the peak of prosperity, the highest standard of living in the world. But it has ancient Rome saying, we too were that high. Don't forget. So, the election of 1920, the Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding, another Ohioan. His running mate would be Calvin Coolidge. And they're very conservative plank. Just think about it. A return to normalcy. Isn't that like to go back to the good old days when life was so much better before the war and the disruption of the progressive era? Let's get back to when things were good. And after the war, I could understand that idea. The war and then the Spanish flu. Let's go back when life was easier. The Democrats nominated very conservative Democrat James Cox. Only reason we mention his running mate is because it's a very young Franklin Roosevelt, who looked like he was an up-and-coming politician. The Socialists also ran Eugene Debs. And remember, Debs did quite well in 1912. He went to prison for opposing the draft, and he was actually in a prison. In fact, let's look at the totals. Debs got over 1 million votes, most of the minor votes, from a prison cell in Atlanta. But it was an overwhelming Harding sweep. It was, in fact, only the South. Tennessee voted for Harding. That was issues about suffrage. That was a different political issue at that time. So, Harding's administration was scandal-ridden. He was very limited intellectually. He was lazy. He spent most of his time drinking, having multiple affairs, at least one child out of wedlock. Supposedly I don't know how else to put it, but a dancing girl, maybe something else, actually died in the basement of the White House, and the Attorney General, Harry Doherty, actually helped cover it up. I mean, this was unreal what was going on. The most famous was the Teapot Dome scandals at cartoon shows. Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, sold off the U.S. oil reserves that was kept in caves in this unique mountain in Wyoming called Teapot Dome, and sold it off, and he took kickbacks, violating the law. We're not going to worry about Doherty. He was the scandal-ridden Attorney General. Same thing with the head of the new Veterans Administration, Charles Forbes. He used that place to profit himself. But the big thing was Harding had a heart attack before all of these things came out. And so Harding, people knew he was inept, knew he was not up to the job. Nobody realized how scandal-ridden it was until he passed away. And so I like that cartoon. I still want to know who's behind there being trampled, but we'll find out later. That's where we get to Calvin Coolidge. The video does a great job talking about Coolidge. He did not talk. He was seen as almost like an invisible man behind the scene. His quote there, "The business of America's business," fits in with conservative economics. And that quote, I took one of those memes. I normally don't like to do it, but it fit in so perfectly. And that's classic social Darwinism. I've got to admit, he looks good in that hat. But he came in at a time of it seemed like prosperity. And you can imagine those who were cleaning up during the decade, getting richer as the decade went on, loved him. And those who didn't just assumed my day is coming down the road. And the election of 24, he was an overwhelming favorite. You notice the full dinner pail. Dinner, that's lunch pail. And John Davis would be the Democratic nominee. And the Democrats, terrified of the loss of Cox, they actually nominated someone who economically was as conservative as Coolidge. That's where you get that cartoon of the Wall Street twins. And I'm looking at the screen right now. You have Coolidge and, actually it's Davis and Coolidge. And they're actually puppets, and you notice the hand doing it is J.P. Morgan. Now it's J.P. Morgan Jr., the son of the financier J.P. Morgan. And the progressives would run Wisconsin Robert La Follette. And this would kind of split the progressive vote, but the Democrats were pretty conservative anyways. I just like that picture of Robert La Follette because I love the microphone in his hair. You can see from that Davis button, it's a teapot. They try to use scandal, but Coolidge just was never, they could never tie it to Coolidge. And therefore, if you look at the election, Coolidge won a huge victory. But Robert La Follette did get over 16% of the vote. Once again, the solid South. Coolidge, laissez-faire. And another one of those memes, but it works. You stayed out of business his way, and I love the cash register, and oh, we have a friend in Coolidge. Very much laissez-faire economics. And so with that, the election of 1928, Hubert Hoover would be the Republican nominee. And he came in with an impeccable reputation. Ran the Food Administration, self-made. He was orphaned at a young age, became an engineer, became a millionaire, ran the Food Administration, ran the Red Cross during the horrible Mississippi flood of 1927. And he got good reviews on that. It's seen as like a savior, even though it turned out his views on working people would come out during the flood, were kind of hit, or come out during the Great Depression. They were there during the flood too. Al Smith was the Democratic governor of New York, a Tammany politician, so part of that Democratic machine, and he was Catholic. There'd never been a Catholic president, and there was still intense anti-Catholic bias. And he was what they call the wet, wanted to get rid of, or at least chink away at prohibition. Those who wanted prohibition were called the dries. Get it? And that's partially a prejudice against Catholics and Irish, saying they're drunk and they're not good Protestant stock. And the other thing is very urban. And the thing about the urban is sometimes this is misunderstood. I want to make sure my mic is on. So he was on the radio all over the United States. So this is the first election that the radio was broadcast coast to coast. And so people could hear their presidential candidates. This was a big deal. And Hoover sounded pretty dull and stale, frankly. But Smith had this accent. Well, let me play you a little bit. So let's go ahead then and hit play.
The advent of radio diffusion of the voice without the visual image. They say that Al Smith lost the election against Hoover in 1928 because of the religious issue. Could his voice also have been a factor to voters outside of the Northeast?
Here it is.
Now let's look at the record. Prohibition has found a new line of endeavor for the underworld. They brought life to the bootleggers, and the bootleggers begot the hijackers, and the hijackers begot the racketeers. My friends of the radio audience, the only cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy.
Now, I love that voice. But to people in rural America, that sounded like, well, think about the 1920s and Prohibition. He sounded like a gangster. This anti-urban bias still exists today. People with New York accents, which he had, still are sometimes distrusted in areas with a more dull accent, like, let's say, Montana. So the election, another huge, overwhelming victory for Hoover. Hoover would come rolling in. By the way, I almost forgot the ironic button there, a chicken in every pot. Some of you have read ahead, know what I'm talking about. But we got to get to Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury during Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover's administration. And Mellon personified, he's Treasury Secretary, he personified the conservative economics. He, in many ways, set out the conservative ideology that would dominate this decade. And he was an incredibly wealthy man, and he made it the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. The family had made money in coal and oil and in finance, a lot of money in finance. He was a big player on Wall Street. I'll quit hitting the table. And his goal, or his policy, trickle-down economics. And the idea was funnel money to the wealthy. The rich aren't rich enough. And then that money they will build it, and they're prosperous, and it will trickle down to everybody else. And it would be personified by two massive tax cuts. The highest marginal income tax rate during the war was 73%. The last tax cut in 1926 was would bring that rate down to 25%. That is a huge, almost unprecedented tax cut for the very wealthy. Andrew Mellon himself got an $800,000 tax cut at that time. That's about 8 million, maybe 8 to 12 million today. And think about buying on margin. $800,000 tax cut. He could buy $8 million worth of stock at that time. And that cartoon shows the GOP tax cut and Andrew Mellon the patch, with the idea being the tax cut will cut this watermelon and divvy it to the people. So we have to get to, one more thing to show its conservative ideals. There was a bill in to give a bonus, basically a pension, a one-time pension payment for veterans of World War I. It would take place in 1945. And it passed, but Mellon was completely opposed to this, as he saw helping workers would funnel money away from the rich, and that's where the money should go, people like him. And if you give money to regular people, they'll blow it, they'll drink it away, etc. So, with that, we got to get to trickle-down economics. And so I did not mean to put the highest standard of living cartoon again there, but it popped up again. So let's get to the element of it. Now this is going to be a chart, and the chart is going to go from top down. So we're going to start top and go to the bottom. And it's your basic element of trickle-down or conservative economics to this day. And so the idea is to get money into the hands of the very wealthy. Get money in their hands. And that is going to be by government action. And that is Coolidge, the idea of surveying what the country needs to help business. Now I'm going to get back to government action. So leave some space there. I'm going to get back to what they do, because this is huge. But click. They will take that money and build products. It's called supply. Or another way to look at it is production going up. They'll build factories, they'll hire workers, they'll innovate, they'll create, they'll build roads, buildings, production will boom, they'll invest in business. They will increase supply. And the idea is this: the wealthy are more intelligent than anybody else. How do we know they're intelligent? They're rich. They must be intelligent. They have the money. You give them money and they'll know what to do with it. This goes back to free labor, laissez-faire, all the way back to Hamiltonian economics. The rich are rich because they're smarter and better. And the logic would be, why would you ever give money to somebody who lives in a cardboard box by the river? They don't know how to make money. So, supply. And then they need to hire workers, right? Employment goes up. Now workers have paychecks. Thus, the trickle down. And then demand. The workers will have more money, and therefore they'll buy goods. And what will that do? That's kind of an arrow. Just imagine that's an arrow going back up to the very rich. and more money in their hands, more supply employment. That is the engine of trickle-down economics. And the name it would get by the 1970s would be supply side. Get it? Help the suppliers, the wealthy. Trickle-down economics got a really bad connotation, just that name, because of that little thing called the Great Depression. And so when supply-side economics would come back into fashion, they didn't want to call it trickle-down. And this is the early 1980s. Sometimes you see also supply-side economics as neoliberal. Every president we've had since Ronald Reagan has, for the most part, been some element of supply-side or neoliberal. From Reagan, the first Bush, Clinton, the second Bush, Obama, and Trump. And so let's get to that government action. And here's the administration and tax reduction leading to all these great things for the voters and taxpayers. It's some are kind of weird, but just go with that. Remember, Coolidge liked to fish. So, first off, this is the government action, tax cuts. So tax cuts is number one, regressive. And that means the tax cuts should be regressive in nature. That means the biggest tax cuts go to the very wealthy. So taxes will be, or for the poor, their taxes will be higher. Why? You want to put more money in their hands. So do things like get rid of inheritance taxes and have things like sales tax. Next, get rid of regulations. Remember all those progressive level regulations. The biggie, antitrust. No antitrust. Don't enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. That's why there's all those mergers in the 20s. Also, no financial regulation. Let speculators speculate in the stock market or real estate, because that will create money they can invest in business. Also, no regulation in like worker safety or quality goods. Remember the, things like the, like child labor laws, or for that matter, the Pure Food and Drug Act. So anti-regulation. Next, anti-union. We've already talked a little bit about this, but the Red Scare did that. Unions raise wages. But not only that, they demand worker safety and benefits like vacation and sick leave, bathroom breaks, weekends, things like that. If you're anti-union, it's harder for one worker to negotiate higher wages. No safety net. And this is a very important part of conservative economics. A safety net, and the U.S. had very little safety net anyways. These are examples of a safety net. Social Security, no old age pension. If workers are worried about their retirement tomorrow, they will be less likely to demand higher wages today, because they know they need that job because retirement's coming. So this reduces wages. We do have a system of Social Security that will come in the New Deal. It's relatively low. Workers, when they get older, if they don't have some kind of retirement, they have to work longer, and therefore that decreases wages. No health care. Now, there was already a movement, and this actually started with the tuberculosis, essentially plague around the turn of the last century, that healthcare is so expensive, there should be some kind of government health insurance in some way. But if workers have access to healthcare, they can demand higher wages, because they know even if they lose their job, they will still have healthcare for their family. If they don't have healthcare, they need to keep whatever job they have, because they have to keep the healthcare, and therefore they accept lower wages. No aid for the poor, no welfare, no benefits, and that includes things like unemployment insurance, etc., but no direct aid. If people know that if they're unemployed, they will starve, they will take whatever job they get at whatever wages. That's where we get to no unemployment insurance. If they're laid off, if there's no unemployment insurance, which will come about in the New Deal, if they're laid off, they'll be more desperate to take whatever job they get, thus lowering wages. And so what they wanted with all of this is desperate workers. Desperate workers take lower wages. Remember, the whole goal was to put pour money into the hands of the very rich. And they'll use it, and they will spend money. And so a thing in modern era would be like no aid for college. Very high tuition for college, those kind of things. Because if college students come out of school with a great amount of debt, they got to take whatever job they get. So it's conservative economics that want to get rid of those programs like that. We'll talk more about this in the New Deal for liberal economics and what's going to be called Keynesian economics. So that is the main element of trickle-down economics. The last thing for today, by the way, I am going to ask this. You're going to have to explain trickle-down economics. And you have to answer this. And government action is one of the big things you have to get and answer a couple of these things. I'm still looking at that cartoon. That is a weird cartoon. I don't know what the Japanese affront is. I think it's about the naval pack. But the results of this would be a couple things. First off, yeah, it did lead to some prosperity, but overproduction. If the goal is to increase supply, won't they increase supply? Remember step one of the bust. Overproduction. Number two, this fueled speculation. Fueled it. Why did the very wealthy have to spend money on factories? Starting a business is difficult, hard, risky. Why not invest in things and just get rich? The allure of making money without work is so big. That is why there will be a huge Florida State real estate boom in 25 to 27. And this boom would pop in 1927. People were buying land all over Florida. In fact, it became kind of a joke in Florida that people were buying land sight unseen. So the joke became, hey, I have some swamp land in Florida to sell you. Everybody was buying land and the price went up and up and up. And then people realized, oh, wait, we're buying swamp land. And the bubble popped. People lost their fortunes. Banks couldn't get their repaid or money back. And that would encourage banks trying to make more money, a big boom in the stock market. And as you can see from that picture, that stock market boom seemed to be going much faster than the actual prosperity, thus giving the illusion of prosperity. And another result is a vast inequality of wealth. Thus you can see the government in the middle giving the $20 million tax cut and most of it going to the very wealthy. If the goal is to put more money in the hands of the very rich, it's going to create an inequality anyways. And money will funnel to them because they own the capital. But if they speculate, that means they're not making factories. And that means they're only making more money for themselves and no money's trickling down. And so this was an issue. But I don't think there's anything to fear because the stock market seems invincible going into 1929. And this is from October 22nd. I don't know if there's any key elements about this date. But buy. And as you can tell from that picture, times are going well. Easy credit. And on that happy note, I am done. Now, I have not decided if I'm going to do one more today on the causes of the Great Depression. I think I might wait. But I'm a little bit behind. I meant to do this yesterday. Hopefully the sound worked. I hope everything went okay. And don't forget, you can always go back and copy this, look at this. But I'm going to ask about trickle-down economics. And I'm going to expect things from what I talked about. And as of now, you don't have to do a separate one. I haven't decided if I want to make you draw the graph and take a picture. I wouldn't mind a little picture. I could make a scrapbook. Our days in quarantine and have that in there. So if there's any questions, please drop me a line. But remember, from now on, unless there's something happens, please turn in everything on team. It's just a little bit too hard for me to keep track of everything unless it's on there. And secondly, the test is Monday. There will be assignments up. We have a video up on the Great Depression. It's really well done about the job of Ford and a worksheet. All right, I'm out of here.